In this topic, we're going to discuss the transport of oxygen. So, by the end of this topic, you should be able to answer the questions: what is hemoglobin? How does hemoglobin transport oxygen? What are the properties of hemoglobin that make it good at transporting oxygen? We're going to discuss hemoglobin and carbon monoxide. What is partial pressure? What's the partial pressure of oxygen in air? And then finally, we're going to look at the oxygen dissociation curve and allosteric binding. Large organisms need specialized molecules to transport oxygen. Now, if oxygen just dissolved in the blood and didn't attach to anything, this wouldn't be adequate enough. These specialized molecules are called respiratory pigments, and the one that we're going to look at is hemoglobin. So what is hemoglobin? It's a red pigment that has a relative molecular mass of about 68,000. This means that it's so small and it could be lost from the body during ultrafiltration. Therefore, it's contained in red blood cells that separate it from the plasma. Just to recap, it's a protein made of 4 polypeptide chains, with each containing a heme group. So here you can see a molecule of hemoglobin. Notice the 2 alpha and the 2 beta chains, and the heme group in the middle of each chain. So it can transport both oxygen and carbon dioxide. One molecule of oxygen can combine with each of the 4 heme groups to form oxyhemoglobin. So here you can see the equation. Hb for hemoglobin plus 4 oxygen molecules forms HbO8. What are the properties of hemoglobin that make it good at transporting oxygen? You know that hemoglobin picks up oxygen in the lungs, where the concentration of oxygen is high, and then it releases the oxygen in the tissues where the oxygen is low. This means that it readily associates with oxygen at the gaseous exchange surface and readily dissociates from oxygen at the tissues requiring the oxygen. This is because of a very interesting property of hemoglobin. It can change its affinity for oxygen under different conditions. So here you can see how when oxygen concentration is high, the hemoglobin has a high affinity for oxygen. So oxygen binds readily to the hemoglobin. This occurs at the gaseous exchange surfaces, for example, as the blood flows past the lungs or the alveoli in the lungs. When the oxygen concentration is low, the hemoglobin has a low affinity for oxygen, so oxygen gets released to the respiring tissues. Right, let's have a look at hemoglobin and carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is made from the incomplete combustion of carbon compounds, for example, exhaust fumes and cigarette smoke. Hemoglobin has an affinity for carbon monoxide about 250 times greater than oxygen. So even at low partial pressures of carbon monoxide, carboxyhemoglobin is formed. And carboxyhemoglobin is a very stable compound. The treatment would be to give a mixture of very high oxygen and carbon dioxide to stimulate and increase the rate of breathing. So can you see why carbon monoxide is a potentially lethal gas? This is because you could die from asphyxiation, because that carbon monoxide will bind very tightly to the hemoglobin, so oxygen cannot bind to the hemoglobin. Okay, let's have a look at partial pressure. What is partial pressure? The amount of gas present in a mixture of gases is measured by the pressure it contributes to the total pressure. So this is known as the partial pressure of the gas. Sometimes it's called oxygen tension. The unit of pressure is kilopascals. Okay, let's see what we mean when we talk about the partial pressure in oxygen, or of oxygen. So what is the partial pressure of oxygen in air? At sea level, the atmospheric pressure is 100 kilopascals. If there's 20% of oxygen in the air, then the partial pressure of oxygen will be 20%, so 20 over 100 times 100 kilopascals, which equals about 20 kilopascals. So let's have a look at how this relates to the saturation of hemoglobin. Here you can see the oxygen dissociation curve. So let's go through it step by step. On the x-axis is the partial pressure of oxygen, and on the y-axis is the saturation of hemoglobin. What do you notice about the curve of the partial pressure of oxygen as it's increasing? At low partial pressures, for example, a partial pressure of about 2 kilopascals, have a look at how saturated the hemoglobin is. Can you see that the saturation of hemoglobin is low? This means that hemoglobin is combined with little oxygen. What about at the top of the curve there? So what about a high partial pressure, for example, about 11 kilopascals of oxygen? How saturated is the hemoglobin? Well, it's about 95% saturated. So what does this mean? It means that the hemoglobin is combined with lots of oxygen. So look at the shape of the curve. It kind of looks like an S. So it's a sigmoid shape rather than a straight line. So we can discuss why this is so. So why does this curve have a sigmoid shape? Here you can see a red block representing hemoglobin. So remember that hemoglobin's got 4 polypeptide chains. If one molecule of oxygen binds to the hemoglobin, notice how the shape of the hemoglobin starts to change because the polypeptides start to bind more loosely. As a result, the 3 oxygen molecules or the 3 other oxygen molecules are loaded very easily. So this situation where a molecule changes shape due to something in its environment is called an allosteric effect. So allosteric binding is the uptake of one molecule of oxygen influences the affinity of the binding sites remaining. So when one oxygen molecule binds with one heme group in the hemoglobin molecule, the entire molecule distorts, making it even easier for the next oxygen molecule to combine with the next heme group. So you'll notice that with a very small decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen, for example, changing the partial pressure from about 2 kilopascals to 0 kilopascals, will lead to a lot of oxygen becoming dissociated from hemoglobin. So where do you think you'll find a low partial pressure of oxygen in the body? In the respiring tissues. Here you can see a high partial pressure of oxygen, which you'll find in the alveoli and the lungs. So this is where the hemoglobin picks up the oxygen. This steep part of the curve is important. It shows a small decrease in oxygen partial pressure of the surroundings brings about a large drop in the oxygen saturation in hemoglobin. So meaning oxygen is unloaded if you decrease the partial pressure. Also, a small increase in the oxygen partial pressure will cause a large increase in oxygen saturation. So that's the loading of oxygen. At high oxygen tension or partial pressure, hemoglobin does not release oxygen easily. So the hemoglobin keeps the oxygen bound so that it can travel away from the lungs. But as the hemoglobin goes into areas where there's low oxygen concentration, it dissociates more readily. This is because of the allosteric binding, and that's why the graph isn't a straight line. So this top part of the curve, the loading tension, is measured as or at 95% saturated because hemoglobin's never 100% saturated at normal environmental oxygen tensions. Unloading tension is measured at about 50% saturation because hemoglobin never releases all its oxygen under normal conditions. Right, here's a summary. So what I want you to do is copy down these questions and see if you can answer them or fill in the details. And that concludes our lesson. The end.